This is the use of very this is the one where
Good evening. Well, it's good to be back at Aquinas College. I've been here a couple of times before, I think. I visited the mother house of the sisters once before as well, which is a great privilege and honour. And the topic tonight is G.K. Chesterton, a great favourite of mine. And I want to say from the beginning that it's not just very difficult, it's impossible for me to be dispassionate about G.K. Chesterton. So don't expect this to be a dispassionate talk. I owe a great debt to Chesterton. I have those of you that were at the fundraising talk, the address I gave here a few years ago, would have heard something of my conversion story. I was a very long way from Catholicism. In fact, I hated the church, and hated was the right word, and had no desire for Christ. And it was under grace. Obviously, grace is the prime mover here. But under grace, I owe a debt to Chesterton beyond all others in bringing me to Christ through the reading of Chesterton. So my first book was the book Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton. And just to show what an incompetent salesman I am, I only bought 3 copies and they've sold already. So in fact you can't purchase it over there if you wanted to now. There are, however, to show that I'm not a completely incompetent salesman, 7 other of my volumes over there. But my first book after my conversion was The Life of Chesterton, and it was an act of thanksgiving on my part. And I sometimes say that it was an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. So that's how important he is to me. And he taught me lots of things to turn me around from the sort of hate-filled person that I was and the anti-Catholic bigot that I was. We talk about thanksgiving, but one of the great gifts that Chesterton gave me, and I think gives anybody that reads him, is he gives us thanks for being thankful. In other words, it's about gratitude. It's about wonder. And the wonder of Chesterton is the fact that he taught me to wonder. Chesterton is wonderful because he's wonderful. Because he's full of wonder. He takes nothing for granted. He sees life as a gift. And he also speaks in paradoxes, which I fell in love with Chesterton's paradoxes. Because he sees life as being full of paradoxes. A paradox being an apparent contradiction that points to a deeper truth. Now the title of this talk is G.K. Chesterton Larger Than Life. Well, the reason that Chesterton is larger than life is because he's smaller than the rest of us. Because it takes a big man to know how small he is. And pride is the sin of a small man who thinks he's big. And of course all of this is just enunciating the Christian paradox that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So what we see in Chesterton is the paradox of the unity of wit and wisdom. You know, it was said, I think it was William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, who said, "Why should the devil have all the best tunes?" If you listen to modern music, I doubt that anyone can really believe that he does, but that's another matter. But what Chesterton teaches us is that why should God have all the best jokes? Because Chesterton teaches us that faith is fun, and also that faith is funny. There's a great combination between humour and humility with Chesterton. Chesterton has more fun than the atheists. He has a joie de vivre and a jollity. He's happier. He clearly has the key to happiness. And again, someone who's anti-Catholic reads Chesterton and you see how happy this man is. He exudes happiness in every sentence he writes. What's he got? And can I have some? And of course, his happiness is connected to his humility. Gratitude and humility are the two aspects of Chesterton that are paramount. For instance, Oscar Wilde once said that people do not appreciate sunsets because they cannot pay for them. To which Chesterton responded that Oscar Wilde could pay for sunsets by not being Oscar Wilde. And of course the point Chesterton's making is that cynicism is a sin, and not being able to see that the best things in life, such as sunsets, are free, is also a sin. Although Chesterton was actually being a little bit unfair on poor old Oscar Wilde, because I think Oscar Wilde said that in order to shock, and also to shock us into some sort of sensibility. Because it was Oscar Wilde who also said that a cynic is one who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Oscar Wilde clearly knew the value of the sunset and was really poking fun at those that only knew the price of everything. And if there's no price tag on the sunset, they don't appreciate it. Wilde would have agreed with Chesterton. Wilde also says something which I think is at the centre of everyone's life and the centre of the whole of human society. That we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. Because that's the whole point of life. We are all in the gutter. We're all suffering from original sin. We're all sinners. In that sense, we're all fallen, and we're all fallen in the gutter. The point is, are we face down in the gutter, wallowing in the mire, happy with the dirt, refusing to look up? Or are we in the gutter but looking at the stars and knowing that there's something beyond the gutter? And that something beyond the gutter is the thing that we want, the thing that we desire, the thing that we hope for. So gratitude and humility leads to humour and humility. And Chesterton, of course, was a somewhat large man. Doesn't really do him justice. I'll do him justice. I'd have to put myself out quite as much as I get older. I sort of do it naturally by myself. But we see in Chesterton his mirth about his girth. A man who can laugh at himself. Because during the First World War, when a lot of pressure has been put on British people, young men, or not so young men, to enlist in the army and go and fight in the trenches, Chesterton was on an omnibus, on a bus, and this woman came up to him, and I'm sure if she had a white feather she would have given it to him, and said, "Sir, why are you not out at the front?" And Chesterton said, "Madam, if you go round to my side, you will see that I am." Now, the glory of that is not just that it's funny, but it's the perfect riposte in charity. Because anybody could see, by one look at Chesterton, who incidentally had just recovered from a near fatal sickness, that he was in no fit state to join the army. I have this sort of vision of Chesterton sort of being winched up on a crane and sort of lifted over and lowered into the trench. And then when it's time to go over the top, they'd all be going over the top and he'd be going and wouldn't get very far. And if he did manage to get out of the trench, he'd make a very, very big target. Clearly not fit to serve in the army. So it's a perfect response. They said about Chesterton, he was always arguing, but he never quarrelled. And there we have something which should be an inspiration for all of us. Because we live in a world where we have to defend the faith, where we have to stand up and be counted, if you like. But we have to do it with love. We have to do it with charity. And actually you bring people to Christ by being charitable far more than in winning the argument. So Chesterton was always arguing and never quarrelled. It's a perfect example. No, he could very easily have taken offence, said something rude to the lady. She would have deserved it, quite frankly. But he didn't. And again, he's in New York, or Chicago, one of those places, up north. Or if you live in England, over there. And he was in one of his North American tours, and he was struggling to get into a taxi. He's trying to get into this taxi, this way and that way. And the taxi driver, somewhat concerned, gets out and tries to help him. And the taxi driver offers the practical advice, as he sees it, of, well, perhaps you might find it a bit easier if you go in sideways. And Chesterton said, I have no sideways. More controversially, and I think more profoundly, he talked about the mirth of God. God's sense of humour. And we don't perhaps see a great deal of evidence of that in the Bible. But let's think about what we do know. We know we're made in the image of God. You know, in some ways, you know, everything's made in the image of God. A horse is made in the image of God because God made it. But we're made in the image of God in a special way. In other words, we have certain divine attributes that belong to us and that do not belong to horses or any other part of creation. And one of those, of course, is the ability to reason, which is why reason leads to God. The ability to love, to self-sacrificially give ourselves to the other. Love, of course, as I'm sure you all know, has nothing to do with feeling. Because if it's something to do with feeling, it'd be very transient and very nebulous. Love is an action. Now, the two great commandments of Christ: love the Lord thy God. Don't feel fuzzy and good about him. Love him, even if it doesn't feel fuzzy and good sometimes. That's what love's about. It's easy to love someone when it feels good. Love thy neighbour. Love thine enemy. Love is an action, not a feeling. So we made the image of God in the fact that we can love, the fact that we can reason, the fact that we have freedom, the fact that we have freedom of the will. We're not slaves to our instincts. We're also made in the image of God, as Chesterton was at pains to tell us, and which I was so pleased to learn. We're made in the image of God by the sense of humour that we have. Animals don't laugh, even hyenas. They certainly don't have a sense of humour, and they don't tell jokes. Because the sense of humour is something which comes from the joy of God, the joy of Godhead himself, the joy of who he is. So Chesterton talked, for instance, in The Man Who Was Thursday, about God making seemingly nonsensical practical jokes, such as creating a hornbill, which is a tiny bird with a huge beak stuck on the end of it. But he also talked about the whole of The Man Who Was Thursday really is trying to see God from God's perspective, rather than trying to see God from God's back, trying to see God from the front. And of course, why can't we see God from the front? Well, of course, in one sense, because we can't until we merit, through God's grace and forgiveness, the beatific vision. We can't see God eye to eye until we are in his presence. But another reason why we can't see God in the face is because, well, either he turns his back on us, or we turn our back on him. And which is it? Well, Chesterton talks about the mirth of God, and I have this image that the reason that God turned his back on Adam and Eve was to hide the fact that he was laughing. Now, I like that every single time. We get a couple of embarrassed sniggers. We're not sure that we like that, because Adam and Eve were definitely naughty. They definitely deserved the punishment. But we have to understand that God is omnipresent. Now, God being omnipresent is not just that he's present here and now, or that he's hiding under the desk, or above those lights, or on the ceiling, or behind there. It's because everything is present to God. In other words, there is no past, and there is no future to God. Everything in time is present to God. Difficult for us to get our heads around. But you have to understand, that being so, the fall of Adam and Eve, birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and the last day are all present to God. So he knew everything before he created Adam and Eve. So he doesn't, because if you think back, have images of God's anger, it implies somehow that there's something that we sinners can do that would mess up God's plan, which is nonsense. And let me say one thing here. My daughter's now 5. She was 5 last week. Not quite as cute as she used to be, but she's still pretty cute. But when she was 2, she was very cute. And she used to do things that were naughty. And of course, I'm trying to help her grow in virtue and wisdom. So you chastise her and say, you shouldn't do that, it's not a good thing to do. But it's still darn cute. We don't tell her that, of course, that would ruin everything. We told her that. But sometimes you know you're about to start laughing or smiling, and that ruins the whole effect of the chastisement. So what do? You turn your back on them and you leave the room. Now, Adam and Eve deserved their punishment. We deserve our punishment. But God's not threatened by Adam and Eve or by us. And God loves us more than I love my 2-year-old daughter. So God's laughter, perhaps God's laughter is something we can only experience when we get to heaven. Get to heaven. If you're a Scotsman, it might make some sort of sense. And of course, as the title of my book, Wisdom and Innocence, showed, one of the other things about Chesterton is the way he combines wisdom and innocence. Now, we live in a cynical world, that think that wisdom and innocence are somehow contradictory. No, you become wise by losing your innocence. Now, and Chesterton, of course, addressed this issue. I got the idea for the title of my book from two of his volumes of the Father Brown stories. Now, the first volume was The Innocence of Father Brown, and the later volume was The Wisdom of Father Brown. So Father Brown has both those attributes. Now, he doesn't change. He's nice and cute in the first book, The Innocence, and the second book, The Wisdom of Father Brown, he's become an atheist. No, that's not what happens with Father Brown. He's both wise and innocent simultaneously. It's another Chestertonian paradox. And the paradox is encapsulated in Scripture. Because on the one hand, Christ tells us that we have to become like little children. And if we don't become like little children, we cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So therefore, it's imperative that we become childlike. That if we are not innocent, we need to become innocent. Which is not the same as naive. And yet St. Paul says that when he was a child, he did childish things, but now he's no longer a child, he's put away childish things. So, is St. Paul contradicting Christ? Is St. Paul the first heretic? Now, if I were to say that, I would be a heretic. Clearly, when Christ talks about being childlike, he's talking about retaining our innocence, either remaining or becoming like children. And when St. Paul talks about ceasing to be childish, he's talking about growing in wisdom, about growing up. Because the paradox in the heart of human life is we can't stay naive, we can't stay ignorant of reality. We have to grow, and yet we have to grow without our growth becoming corruption, without life poisoning us. How to grow up, how to cease being childish while remaining childlike. And we see this, of course, in great literature. Who here, by the way, has read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde? Just a few.
Saw the movie.
Just a few. Sorry?
Yeah, saw the movie.
Saw the movie. Yeah, I'm not sure that counts. I'm a literature professor. But Dorian Gray is a parable of childishness. Because Dorian Gray doesn't want to grow up. Dorian Gray sells his soul so that he can continue to look young and act stupidly, while the portrait serves as a mirror of his soul and gets uglier and uglier and uglier and more wicked in its sneer. So Dorian Gray, if you like, is a parable of childishness. The Lord of the Rings, on the other hand, and The Hobbit, is a parable of growing up while remaining childlike. We thank God that Bilbo and Frodo remain like little children, even as they grow in wisdom and courage. And of course, Christ, as the perfect storyteller, gives us various parables, including the parable of the Prodigal Son, which is a parable of both childishness and growing up and becoming childlike. All of them. Because the Prodigal Son, of course, is childish when he leaves home and squanders his inheritance. The bitter experience, the consequences of that childishness lead him to grow up, to grow in wisdom. And that growing up, that growing in wisdom, leads him to becoming childlike, so that he can return to his father and is then received with loving arms. Well, we live in a world now that doesn't believe in growing up. We live in a world, in fact, of Dorian Grays. God help us. So one Dorian Gray in the novel caused enough chaos. So we can grow up, ultimately, by spending time with our elders. We live in an age that treats the past with contempt. The only way that the progressive agenda can be pushed through is if everybody's ignorant of the past, because the past doesn't believe in that stuff. The past is not backward. The past is not ignorant. The great philosophers are in the past. The great theologians are in the past. The great literature is in the past. The great music is in the past. Great art is in the past. And Chesterton sums up the whole myth, as in the bad sense of being a lie, in this sense, a story that doesn't tell the truth, of the progressives, in his book, The Everlasting Man. Who's read The Everlasting Man? I think Dorian Gray might win. But in that book, Chesterton looks at what C.S. Lewis would call chronological snobbery, treating the past with contempt. And he looks at this in the terms of how we view our ancient ancestors, particularly how we view the so-called Stone Age ancestors. Chesterton talks, and I'm paraphrasing here for those who know the book very well, just because I am. At least I'm admitting that I am. But I'm basically paraphrasing the gist. Now, the modern understanding of the Stone Age man is, as depicted by Hollywood and modern fiction, is of a brute who's only sort of 2 steps up from a gorilla, who drags his wife around by the hair. Before, when he gets tired with her, he then hits her over the head with a club and probably eats her. Because, of course, they were pretty ignorant and primitive and barbaric, and only one step removed from the apes. But Chesterton says, what happens when you actually look at the evidence, rather than seeing through the eyes of pride, the eyes of chronological snobbery? What do we actually discover about our Stone Age ancestors when we look at the evidence? He says, when we walk into the cave, do we find a nice, neat pile of female skulls, all with a neat crack in them, like eggs, cracked? No, we don't. When we walk into that cave, what we find on the floor, on the walls of the cave, is art. which, by the way, is one of the other marks of the image of God in man that distinguishes man from the rest of the creatures. The fact that, like God, we create. Only God creates ex nihilo. Only God makes things from nothing. We make things from other things that already exist. We subcreate, to use Tolkien's term for it. But we have that creative faculty, that creative gift. We make in the manner that we were made, in the image of God. So all that we see in evidence when we look in the cave, says Chesterton, is that our ancient ancestors were remarkably similar to us. And Chesterton, who trained to be an artist before he became a writer, said it's not just art, it's good art. He admires the sense of movement in the deer that's being pursued by the hunters, the stroke of the pen and the movement of their head turning. Not just art, but good art. Much less primitive than 21st century art. Of course, the everlasting man has two meanings. The lesser meaning is this, is that we are essentially unchanging in our imageness of God through every generation. But the other aspect is the everlasting man is Jesus Christ. And insofar as we are Christ-like, we become everlasting. And that the whole of history... By the way, Chesterton wrote this book, as I'm sure you might know, as a riposte to H.G. Wells's outline of history, which is basically there's this ascent of humanity from the primeval soup of ignorance through a period of superstition and religion, which are synonymous, to a golden age ushered in by science, where everybody will get on with everybody else and there'll be no more religion because nobody else will be superstitious. Wells, by the way, H.G. Wells's last book was called The Mind at the End of Its Tether, because he experienced the horrors of the Second World War. Well, not even experienced, he saw the horrors of the Second World War, Holocaust, gas chamber, atom bomb, and this was what technology had brought, and it brought H.G. Wells to the mind at the end of its tether. But for Chesterton, against that idea of the ascent of man, is that the whole of history points towards the incarnation, points towards God's entry into it as man. So the whole of history points towards the incarnation, not just before it, but since it. That the incarnation is the centre of history, to which all history points, and from which all history makes sense. And let's look at this, because the main evidence for the fact that humanity is progressing is the fact that there's no doubt at all that technology is progressing, in the sense that we've got more of it and the new things that build on the previous ones. But to think that 21st century man is superior to, for instance, 16th century man because he has iPads and laptops and smartphones is judging the child by the toys that we give him. You know, if we were to go out to the third world and go out in the middle of the savannah somewhere in some dark region of Africa that's still largely unimpacted by modernity, and we saw the children there playing with a soccer ball, because that's all they had, and we came back to the United States and said, this proves that these people are primitive and backward because they don't have iPads, they don't have soccer balls to play with, we'd be called racist. And, by the way, quite rightly so. But that's basically what we do when we judge the past. They only had soccer balls and not iPads, therefore they would be ignorant in connection to us. Let me give you an example in practice that this could happen. If I could write fiction better, I'd be tempted to make a novel of this. I imagine Plato walking into a modern American high school. And he would be the object of ridicule. First of all, because of the silly clothes he was wearing. And then, of course, you'd go outside, and the first car he'd see, he'd take a look at. He'd recognise things that were quite clearly wheels, even if the wheel's not quite like he's seen before. And he might go around the front and ask them, well, whereabouts do you attach the horses? That would be hilarious. But within 2 weeks, Plato would have probably bought himself some clothes from the latest chain store, looked just like all the other kids on the block, and would have learned to drive. Let's face it, an idiot can learn to drive, an idiot can learn to play computer games. So he'd learned to drive, and in other words, he's mastered 21st century culture in 2 weeks. But then he starts to ask some rather awkward questions about the meaning of life, or what they understand truth to be. Or what is. And they'd look at each other, and they wouldn't have one single answer. Because they're the ignorant ones. They're the primitive ones. They're the ones that are not being educated in the great truths and the great treasures of Western civilization. Now, Chesterton says that the Catholic Church saves us from the deplorable degradation of being children of our own age, being a child of our time, being a slave of the zeitgeist. You know, and another thing that never changes is that every generation has the choice to worship the Heiliger Geist or the Zeitgeist, the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of the age. And you know, probably in every generation, the Zeitgeist worshippers outnumber the Heiliger Geist worshippers. In other words, those who truly believe in Christ, who truly try to live the gospel, are always the minority in every generation. In that sense, nothing really changes. As Lewis said on this subject, fashions are always coming and going, but mostly going. And this is absolutely true, because you know that if someone is fashionable, next year they're going to be out of fashion. And there's nothing more out of fashion than somebody that was in fashion the previous year. And Chesterton also said the church is the one continuous institution that's been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years. An institution that's been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years, and yet the modern world, with its new ideas, thinks the church has nothing to teach them, teach it. This idea, by the way, of the church growing in wisdom as the mystical body of Jesus Christ moving through time was encapsulated by Tolkien, particularly the characters of the Ents in The Lord of the Rings. That might just confuse you. But the fact is that the Ents grow in wisdom, and the whole idea is trees live longer than everybody else. And it's encapsulated by Tolkien in one of his letters. It shows why Tolkien loves trees. It's okay to be a tree hugger as long as you're a Thomistic Catholic tree hugger. Because Tolkien said that he could not, this is in the height of the mania, madness following in the wake of the so-called spirit of Vatican II that the two most recent popes have done so much to enlighten us about. But he said, Tolkien said, I do not understand the madness or the mania of believing that the early church is superior to the church today. He says, because I don't understand why a sapling is considered superior to the full-grown tree. And he said, and in any case, if the sapling is superior to the full-grown tree, you don't get back to the purity of the sapling by chopping down the tree. You simply kill the tree. And in that metaphor that Tolkien gives us there is a perfect encapsulation of what the mystical body of Christ is. After seeing 2,000 years of human folly, 2,000 years of human heresy, new heresies, most of which are just older heresies with a different label stuck on. An institution that, as Chesterton says, has been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years. So what happens if we do decide that that institution is not worth listening to? In other words, what happens if we don't grow up? Well, if we don't grow up, when we're 70, we'll look like Mick Jagger. And he summed up what it's about not to grow up when he sang back in the 1960s, "I can't get no satisfaction," which is not only negative but double negative. It should be a positive really, but we know what he means. I can't get no satisfaction. Well, in other words, he cannot be happy. It doesn't matter how much he indulges himself, he cannot be happy. Because the word satisfaction, of course, comes from the Latin satis, which means enough. Somebody who always wants more, by that very fact, never has enough. If you want more, you are unhappy. Now, Mahatma Gandhi said the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. You want satisfaction? Find God. Because God is enough. What Christ did for us is enough. And the paradox is that Christ suffered to make us happy. And what that means, of course, as we're called to take up our cross and follow him, is that the acceptance of suffering is the secret of life. Not suffering, by the way. Suffering isn't the secret of life. The acceptance of suffering is the secret of life. And the acceptance of suffering is the secret of happiness. In fact, there's a character in a novel by Maurice Baring, a great friend of Chesterton's, a priest character, who says, when you understand the acceptance of sorrow, you will understand everything. It is the secret of life. Because if you grow in holiness enough, the acceptance of suffering is replaced by the embrace of suffering, by the desire for suffering. I'm not there, by the way, just in case you wonder for one single moment. I'm working at accepting it, but I'm not quite at the embracing it stage yet. But I know people, through my understanding the history of the saints, who do. And unaccepted suffering is the destruction of happiness. Because the one thing that's absolutely certain in life for all of us is that suffering is going to happen. Basically, the whole of humanity is present on Golgotha, with Christ in the centre, suffering for us, though he is without sin. And we as humanity on either side of him, suffering because of our sin. The good thief and the bad thief. And we just have to choose to either accept that suffering because we deserve it and ask for God next to us, suffering with us, to forgive us and accept us into his kingdom, or we blame him, hate the cross, hate our lives, and die a miserable death. We're all carrying our crosses. There's no choice. Do we do it willingly or not? And of course, that's all about the difference between the good thief and the bad thief is about humility. And it all comes back to humility, and we shouldn't be that surprised about that. Because the original sin of Satan was a sin of pride. The original sin of Adam and Eve was a sin of pride. The antidote to that poison is humility. Humility is the secret of happiness. Pride is the cause of all unhappiness. What I'd like to do now, just before we finish, is to give you a little bit of a, I won't say dramatic interlude, because I certainly can't act, but I'm going to give you the viewpoint of Chesterton and the viewpoint of someone called Holbrook Jackson, who represented like the 21st century opinion. Now, I'm not organised. I normally bring a hat for this purpose. Does anybody have a hat I can borrow? I'll accept the habit if not. No, I'm joking. Or a turban for that matter, but I'm also joking. May I? Thank you. Okay. Right. When I'm wearing the hat, I'm going to just in the baseball cap. Now that's interesting. Anyway, when I'm wearing a hat and facing this way, thus, as you can tell, the likeness is amazing. I'm G.K. Chesterton. When I face this way, then I'm Holbrook Jackson, okay? His modern interlocutor. Notice Chesterton is facing right, and the other one's facing wrong. Okay. Be contented when you have got all you want. Till then, be happy. Don't think, do. Do think, do. A lie is that which you do not believe. This is a lie, so perhaps you don't believe it. As soon as an idea is accepted, it is time to reject it. No, it is time to build another idea on it. You are always rejecting and you build nothing. Truth and falsehood in the abstract do not exist. Then nothing else does. Truth is one's own conception of things. The big blunder. All thought is an attempt to discover if one's own conception is true or not. No two men have exactly the same religion. A church, like society, is a compromise. The same religion has the two men. The sun shines on the evil and the good, but the sun does not compromise. This one's one of my favourites. Only the rich preach content to the poor, when they're not preaching socialism. In a beautiful city, an art gallery would be superfluous. In an ugly one, it is a narcotic. In a real one, it is an art gallery. Negations without affirmations are worthless and impossible. Theology and religion are not the same thing. When the churches are controlled by the theologians, religious people stay away. Theology is simply that part of religion that requires brains. We are more inclined to regret our virtues than our vices, but only the very honest would admit this. I don't regret any virtues except those I have lost. That's the saint speaking. Every custom was once an eccentricity. Every idea was once an absurdity. No, no, no. Some ideas were always absurdities. This is one of them. No opinion matters finally except your own. Said the man who thought he was a rabbit. The future will look upon man as we look upon the ichthyosaurus, as an extinct monster. The future won't look upon anything. No eyes. Thank you. No, I hope you're clapping Chesterton, not Holbrook Jackson there, otherwise we're in big trouble. So just to finish off with a few more Chesterton witticisms then. Another favourite of mine, when I was on my path to conversion under Chesterton's benign influence, was his view of the skeleton. He says, we have this view of the skeleton as something morbid, and a symbol of death. He said that's very, very inappropriate. He said, because really the skeleton is the very architecture of life. I mean, look around you, there are about 50 or 60 skeletons in this room. And we never see the skeleton the way we usually see it, just wearing a mask, and the skin and what have you. But we always experience skeletons actually in real life, not as something creepy, but as something very, very lovable, as our fellow men and women. Another very important thing that changed my life, radically changed my perception of things, was Chesterton said, if a thing is worth doing at all, it's worth doing badly. Now, when I first read that, I thought, no. I love Chesterton. He normally speaks common sense, but this is nonsense. I was always taught by my father, the thing is worth doing well, worth doing at all, it's worth doing well. But of course, the paradox is that they're both true. But the further paradox is that you can't do a thing well until you've done it badly first. You know, if the greatest soccer players in the world had given up when they first kicked the ball because they couldn't do it very well, they would never have become good soccer players. They had to believe that the thing was worth doing badly before they could do it well. But in another sense, you know, it's better to be a bad Catholic than not to be a Catholic. It's better to be a miserable sinner who goes to Mass than a miserable sinner who doesn't. If things worth doing at all, it's worth doing badly. But of course, we shouldn't be content with doing it badly. The idea of the spiritual life is to be working to get it better. By the way, I'm going to say something now. Oscar Wilde said this. If there are any Anglicans in the audience, blame Oscar Wilde, not me. Well, that was the warning. You can cover up your ears if you like. But Oscar Wilde said that the Catholic Church is for saints and sinners. The Anglicans will do for everyone else. Of course, the joke is there is nobody else. Because we're all saints or sinners. In fact, the saints were sinners. And hopefully most of the sinners, or some of the sinners, are trying to be saints. Chesterton also said that if you want to see something clearly, you have to stand on your head. Again, that's counterintuitive. No, you don't. That's silly. Just being silly. You know, you stand on your head, you just fall over. Silly. But what Chesterton's getting at is that what part of the fallenness of humanity is we take even the most beautiful things for granted. That God presents to us every day of the year, well, every day of the year the sun comes out, every day of the year a beautiful sunrise. And at the end of the day, a beautiful sunset. And they're all unique. No sunrise is ever the same as any other. It's the most beautiful work of art, the most beautiful gallery, the most beautiful art gallery you're ever going to see. And it's free, and it's there every day. And most of us don't even bother to look at it. In other words, for us to be able to be startled into the beauty and brilliance and majesty of the life in which we live and the world in which we live, we have to stand on our heads. We have to see it from a new and astonishing angle, because we've become too ingrained in our habits to see it through our everyday eyes. Chesterton also said, we don't live in the best of all possible worlds. We live in the best of all impossible worlds. This world is not possible through random chance. Everything you see about you is not possible through random chance. We live in the best of all impossible worlds. It needed a divine, supernatural creator. And most of all, we see in Chesterton, the purpose of growing old is to grow up, not spend all our money on anti-aging cream. And that we cease being childish by becoming childlike. That we gain wisdom through innocence. That we gain wisdom through wonder. And just to show I'm with it, by the way, having committed the great heresy of criticising Mick Jagger, one of my favourite lines from modern rock music is a track by U2, the Irish band. And the line is, or two lines probably technically, if you want to kiss the sky, you have to learn how to kneel. And to come back to the title of the talk, G.K. Chesterton is larger than life because he spent his life on his knees. Thank you very much.